In the previous video, we made a distinction that matters, that there's a frontier of AI, the bleeding edge, where people test what just became possible. And then there's the settlement, the place just behind it, where proven discoveries become leading edge best practices that conventional businesses can actually build with. For most businesses, the settlement is the right place to be, but it is not the destination. Because you can live in the settlement, right, adopt the right tools, install the right workflows, use all the right language, and still lose. Why? Because if those best practices don't connect, then they don't compound. In fact, they create technical debt. So the real goal is not just to build in the settlement. The real goal is to build the grid. Now, once you decide that your company should not risk itself on the bleeding edge and that you want to wait until things are proven and then adopt the best practices, then that saves you from frontier envy. Great. But it's still incomplete because best practice adoption is not the same as compounding architecture. And this is the key insight. The question is not only what's proven enough to install. The question is, how do we build our AI systems so that every proven thing we install strengthens the whole? This is the move from settlement mentality to infrastructure mentality, because the settlement is where the city function of synergy begins. The grid is where the city starts reinforcing itself. It's where context and intent and agents and workflows, memory and judgment stop existing as separate improvements and start functioning as one operating system for the business. This is the grid, not a tool stack, but a growing reasoning infrastructure. And here's the hidden problem. Inside of the settlement, businesses can still build poorly, all right? One useful tool here, one great workflow here, one smart context layer someplace else. And each piece may be good and may actually create results. But if those pieces don't connect, then the business doesn't become more intelligent. It becomes more fragmented. And that's the trap. Because AI does not only create more capability, it creates more outputs. More documents, more dependencies, more context, more chances for drift. And that gets worse as you move up the maturity ladder. From prompting to context engineering to agentic workflows to multi-agent teams to cross-domain multi-agent systems. At every level, you're creating more context to manage, more tokens to burn, more retrieval complexity, and more opportunities for the system to get weird. So the real problem is not, can we use AI tools to improve productivity? Of course we can. The real problem is, can we turn all of those outputs into a system that gets stronger as it grows rather than weaker? Because accumulation is not compounding. Integration is compounding. Accumulation creates bloat. Integration creates leverage. This is where the grid becomes concrete. Because a graph-based reasoning layer gives the system something that normal context files never can. Persistent, structured, relationship-aware, reasoning-based memory. Right? Your context files still teach the AI how to think, your standards, your voice, your frameworks, your intent. But the graph stores that in a form which is machine readable, so the system can access it efficiently and reason with precision. So instead of rereading and reinterpreting 50 different business context documents on every query, the system retrieves the exact subgraph that it needs. This means lower token burn, less latency, less drift, greater consistency. And then the real advantage appears, right? New documents, workflows, and agents don't just inflate the context window, they enrich the graph. The system gets more capable as it grows instead of more cluttered. Again, this is the grid, the layer that turns growth into reinforcement rather than fragmentation. And here's what we want to get clear, because the AI maturity model might suggest that the graph comes last, right? But it doesn't. It's not context engineering then agents, then multi-agent teams, and then someday a knowledge graph. No, the graph is the integrating substrate at each one of those stages. Context shouldn't just live in documents, it should live in a reasoning structure. Intent should not just become another instruction set, it should build onto that same reasoning structure. Agents shouldn't operate from isolated context bundles. They should operate from that shared knowledge structure. And new outputs that all of these agents are generating shouldn't pile up as more documents. They should sharpen and integrate into this reasoning layer. That's the shift. Not more documents, although you're going to have more documents, but because it's processed, better reasoning. Right? Not broader context, but compounding intelligence. That's how a business stops collecting tools and starts building grid position. So let's look at this through the example of two different companies, both of which are in the settlement, but one of which is focused on the grid. First, you've got a company that is in the settlement. It's avoiding frontier envy, avoiding the bleeding edge. And in the process, it improved its prompting, it built context libraries, it added some intent, it built some agents, maybe some multi-agent teams, and each one of those pieces is adding to the business, but they're not integrated. So when scale shows up, the more successful each of those pieces are, right? Each part of that, each is generating more documents, more outputs, more context to manage. And the system starts straining. The memories fragment, the rules don't fit. Relevance gets murkier. Drift rises. Costs, tokens rise. The company built in the settlement, but it did not build the grid. Now imagine the same company built differently. The prompting feeds the context in the grid. The context feeds the intent feeds the agents feed the shared reasoning with their documents, refining the process as it goes. Right now, the next leading edge practice is easier to install. The next agent is easier to train. The next new model, a new breakthrough is easier to integrate and use immediately because it's not landing on a blank surface. It's plugging into an existing reasoning infrastructure. It's not just a settled business. It's a grid building business. This is why the next competitive layer is not just leading edge adoption in the settlement, it's grid design. Because the businesses that win next, that can handle not just the next 3 months or 6 months, but 12, 18, 24 months, as this AI revolution continues to exponentially grow, they'll be the ones that build in the settlement so well that every best practice they adopt becomes part of a larger reinforcing system. And yes, the earlier you start building that grid, the deeper that moat becomes because everything's integrated, and that's going to be hard to catch up with. Anyone can take on the new tool. The question is, can you use the new tool in your business model in a way that integrates? That way, the next working system, the next class of agents, when those arrive, you're not starting over. You're adding them to a system that is already built and meant for that. Then it compounds. Not one tool, not one workflow, not one isolated win, but a business where every layer of intelligence makes the rest of the system stronger. Again, the grid. And once you've built that, then later competitors don't enter on the same terms, even if they have the same tools. So here's the clean map. The frontier is bleeding edge experimentation. The settlement is leading edge best practices. And the grid is the compounding edge of integration. It's where those best practices become operating infrastructure. When context connects to intent, intent connects to agents, agents connect across workflows, workflows connect across departments, memory and judgment become structured and shared instead of siloed. This is the world of the builders. And this is the moat logic. Right? The real moat isn't just being in the settlement early, although that helps. It's building your position so deeply into a grid that every new layer of growth, a new opportunity, strengthens your position. So if this makes sense for you in your business model, then settlement thinking isn't enough. Because the trap isn't only adopting too early on the bleeding edge when that's not your business model. The trap is adopting in fragments, accumulating best practices without building the grid that integrates them and makes them reinforce one another. So make sure your team or your consultants understand that the goal is not just to install what works, but to build your position deeply enough into an operating grid that every new layer of growth strengthens you, so that you get compounding intelligence and avoid disconnected workflows that get harder to hold together over time. And if you want a better understanding of this for evaluating it in your situation, get our white papers, our free reports, or run your situation by one of our consultants at compoundintelligencepartners.com or CIP-AI.com. Because it's when you decide that you're going to build the grid, the next thing is how quickly do you get there? Are you going to build your own grid, or are you going to allow other people to build the grid and then just leverage theirs and lose your distinct competitive advantage? And that's what we want to talk about next.